The American Renaissance. What is the American Renaissance? The American Renaissance was a period of American history that paved the way for many literary movements and traditions used today. It is a period of cultural, political, and social revolution and was defined by two major literary movements, Transcendentalism and Romanticism. Poetry also played a special role in the American Renaissance, and many great American authors, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Emily Dickinson, emerged from this period. When did the American Renaissance take place? The American Renaissance is most notably recognized to have occurred between the 1830s, lasting until the end of the American Civil War. It was a period in history that defined political independence and sparked a blaze of nationalism and social reform. This was an era that shaped the American future unlike any other time in history. The culture of the American Renaissance. The culture of the American Renaissance emerged from the wake of the American Revolution. Many Americans were patriotic but sought to expand their ideals through concepts such as manifest destiny and sought new land throughout the American frontier. Conquering Native American and Spanish nations, American settlers sought new ways for American dominance and governance. Slavery became more prominent throughout the land, and with the aid of the American Revolution and Industrial Revolution, many were able to accomplish this task. Politics of the American Renaissance. The politics of the American Renaissance were fueled by literature that presented many of the philosophies of the political and social reformers of that day. Some of the biggest literary authors, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, advocated for social causes of reform such as anti-slavery, women's rights, and Native American rights. There was also the introduction of laws and delegations on how the American government would address the Native American presence. But there was a growing need for American literature that was worthy of publication and took on a more narrative fictional approach. The need for works that rivaled that of their English and European counterparts grew, and the need and demand for brash political writings diminished. Authors like Emerson sought to find the balance between these two and still find the need to advocate for the growing social issues aforementioned. Religion of the American Renaissance. In the aftermath of the American Revolution, the religious tone of many Protestant leaders became more accepting of those outside the Puritan faith. There was no longer the limitation of predestination set before those who would seek to convert to the Christian faith. Many slaves, Native Americans, and Catholics who sought the Puritan way of life were able to convert by simply accepting Christ and adhering to the Puritan lifestyle. There was a growing belief that man was now held accountable for his or her actions, and that by weighing good deeds to evil deeds, one could determine his or her place in the afterlife. Transcendentalism system of belief especially became more widely accepted, and people began to feel more in control of their spiritual destinies and no longer bound by puritanical ideologies. Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism, as defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica Online, is a 19th century movement of writers and philosophers in New England who were loosely bound together by adherence to an idealistic system of thought based on a belief in the essential unity of all creation, the innate goodness of man, and the supremacy of insight over logic and experience for the revelation of the deepest truths. Transcendentalist authors included Ralph Waldo Emerson and Emily Dickinson. Emerson held to this ideal so much so that he wrote a lecture on it that outlined the basis of transcendentalist ideals, of which included that the spiritual held precedence over that which was prudent and practical, and that the individual should be open to pleasurable emotions that allot for optimistic disposition. He also held to an emphasis on nature and the inspirational and healing outlook it bore on the soul, and felt that man and nature could live harmoniously. The role of poetry. Many authors of the 19th century were inspired by transcendentalist and romantic ideals. Because much of poetry can be widely interpreted, many authors use poetry as a means to express their insights and emotions regarding cultural, political, and social issues that they faced. Events such as slavery and the Civil War inspired writers to make sense of and expose many of the social injustices of that time. And because poetries and poems were far more simple and easier to publish than much larger works, authors used poetry to propel the American literary Renaissance movement forward by presenting their works for publication as a means to inspire and yet condemn society and social issues. Ralph Waldo Emerson. According to the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Ralph Waldo Emerson is arguably the most influential writer of the 19th century, the writer with whom numerous other significant writers of the time sought to come to terms. He influenced many other authors of this period, including Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, and he was an avid socialist, reformist, and abolitionist who advocated for slaves, Native Americans, and women's rights. He rejected the view of John Locke and Puritan ideals and was considered by some to be the father of transcendentalism. Some of his most famous works include Nature, Self-Reliance, Brahma, and A Letter to Walt Whitman. Nathaniel Hawthorne. According to the Norton Anthology of American Literature, Hawthorne was the most significant fiction writer of the antebellum period. He wrote many narrative works of fiction that supported and held an emphasis on real situations, but were influenced by disturbing topics, such as psychological and social issues. He supported individual responsibility and creative self-expression and placed an emphasis on realism in retrospect to dark, mysterious, and disturbing topics. He was an anti-transcendentalist and openly disagreed with and opposed many of the transcendentalist writers that emerged during this period. His works focus more on the effects of sin and guilt and how that guilt can lead to psychological and negative impacts. Some of his most notable works were The Scarlet Letter, The House of Seven Gables, and Twice Told Tales. Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is recognized as one of the greatest American poets, a poet who continues to exert an enormous influence on the way writers think about poetic craft and vocation. Though much is not known about her during her lifetime, it wasn't until her death in 1886 that she became an American phenomenon. Her poems covered a wide array of topics that range from religion to nature to the necessity of faith and suffering. Much of her poems explored the pursuit of truth and followed her own unique poetic style of writing that had not yet been seen before in American literature. And though many of her topics of her poems were defiant, particularly to the puritanical system of belief, she sought higher meaning and accepted many of the ideals found in transcendentalism. Some of her most famous works include Success is Countess Sweetest, Our Share of Night to Barren Soul, and Wilt Thou Toss Again. In summary, the American Renaissance was a period that ranged from the 1830s to the end of the Civil War and was a period of cultural, political, and social revolution. It was defined by two major literary movements, Transcendentalism and Romanticism, and poetry played an important role. It also produced many of Americans' greatest authors, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Emily Dickinson.